All right, hello and welcome. My name is Diane Dehoney. I'm the Community Service Librarian at the Paul Sawyer Public Library. We're so glad that you're joining us tonight for this virtual program from the archive, an LGBTQ history of Kentucky, presented by Dr. Jonathan Coleman of the Faulkner Morgan Archive in Lexington. We're so glad to have him here tonight. And before I get ready to introduce him, ask just once again if you've just logged on, if you don't mind to mute your microphone. If you do have a question during the presentation, feel free to pop it in the chat or save it until the end of the presentation, and we'll have plenty of time that you can ask your questions of Dr. Coleman or comments or anything like that. If you have stories to tell, we'll be glad for that. So, but without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker tonight. Dr. Jonathan Coleman is the co-founder and president of the Faulkner Morgan Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit that saves and shares the LGBTQ history of Kentucky. He was the James Still Fellow at the University of Kentucky, earning his doctorate in history in 2014. He often lectures on queer history and was a consultant for the Kentucky LGBT Heritage Initiative funded by the National Park Service. Coleman's first book, Anywhere Together, A Queer History of Kentucky, is forthcoming from the University Press of Kentucky. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Coleman, if you would help me to welcome him.
Thank you, Diane. I certainly do appreciate it. And thanks to the Paul Sawyer, fantastic library doing so much good work in our capital. And it is an honor to be here. It's a shame not to be in Frankfurt. I see that we have several of our Frankfurt supporters and our friends here tonight. So I'll miss getting to see you in person, but maybe next time. And it really is. It is always a pleasure. It's always an honor to get to share with my fellow Kentuckians, a surprising story, that few people would expect. The material that's been collected by the Faulkner Morgan Archive. So as Diane mentioned, the Faulkner Morgan Archive is a nonprofit archive, community generated, that started in 2014, and we have one mission. We save and share Kentucky's lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer history. And what we are finding is really, it's just amazing. Here you can see some of our various events. The history of the LGBTQ community in Kentucky is long, it's diverse, it's a nationally important history. And the goal of the archive is to capture that story and to share it with the world. The archive holds over 15,000 individual items. We have over 200 hours of recorded oral histories. And today, I'm going to spend about 20-30 minutes sharing some of those stories, sharing some of those artifacts with you, and that will give us a good chunk of time to join in conversation, to hear your stories, to hear your questions, to have a conversation at the end. It's one of my favorite parts. So just a little tip of the iceberg of some of the stories in the Faulkner Morgan. And we'll be chronological. I'm going to start with the earliest story we have represented in the Faulkner Morgan, and that dates all the way back to 1775. So before there even is a Kentucky, LGBTQ folks are here and they're making important contributions. The first story is about two settlers, originally born in Virginia, Robert Craddock, and an immigrant from France. His name was Peter Tardieu. And they had both served in the Virginia Continental Army during the American Revolution. We don't know much about their early lives. For example, we don't know exactly when Peter Tardieu left France and immigrated to the United States. But we do know By the 1780s, they are both in what is now Kentucky, living in Danville. And by the early 1800s, they are now living in Western Kentucky at a plantation called the Hermitage, which is right outside of present-day Bowling Green. The two men enslaved a large number of Black Kentuckians, but unknown anywhere else in Kentucky, Tardivu actually started a school there to educate those enslaved children. In fact, we know that one of their students, his name was Willis Russell. If you've been to Danville, Willis Russell's house still stands in Danville. He returns to Danville and starts what is arguably the first Black school for Black children in the state of Kentucky. The two men do emancipate those they had enslaved. In fact, the property that they had owned there near Bowling Green was separated amongst those families. And Robert Craddock, who is the last of the pair to die, left their fortune to the city of Bowling Green to fund schools for poor children. And that endowment was actually still funding the public schools of Bowling Green as late as the 1920s. And at their deaths, the two of them were buried side by side. And in fact, you can see there their tombstones in Bowling Green today. In the 1920s, the founder of Western Kentucky University published an article for the Filson Society in Louisville about these two men. And he's relating the same facts that I just did, but he went further and he explicitly says tradition holds that the two men were, and to quote him, queer is the word that he uses. And he's pretty clear in what he means by that. You know, he follows it up saying that even their faults lean to virtue's side, which is pretty funny. And he has all of these imagined scenes where, you know, they're walking arm in arm into a field of maple trees and they decide that's where they're going to be buried together. An interesting article, to say the least. It is also in the 1920s, right after this article is published, that the city of Bowling Green moves the bodies of Craddock and Tardivu. Where they had been buried had become a Black neighborhood and a Black cemetery. And Peter Tardivu were buried right in the center of it. So the city leaders actually moved those bodies out of that Black cemetery and put them in the main cemetery in downtown Bowling Green, where they are today. These are their headstones. And interestingly enough, they refer to each other as comrades in arms. Recently, the cemetery in Bowling Green published a short pamphlet where they intimate that these two men were known to be a couple, causing a little bit of scorn from the local community. Kentucky is rare to have a queer story that dates so early. Indeed, there are few like it anywhere in the country. Most of our history is much more difficult to find, as these people were living in a time when many were trying desperately to hide. Sometimes we don't even have stories of individuals, we just have the material evidence of LGBTQ lives. And let me show you what I mean. These are really fun. These are stereoscopic cards. So you would put them in a stereoscope and they would look 3D. These were found in Georgetown in an old house there in a family's little collection. And they play openly with same-sex desire. It's actually a set of 4 cards. And so it's 2 women. You can see there that they're getting married. One, the darker headed one, is always in more masculine dress. The 2 even have a baby. And then that last card, the masculine dressed woman asks, how did that baby get its blue eyes? Now, for some people, right, this could just be maybe a little slightly edgy parlor joke. But if you're a woman who loves women living in Georgetown around 1900 when these were printed, these cards could be a revelation to you, right? That other forms of love, other forms of family can exist. And you actually see this a lot in queer networks, an intentional ambiguity, creating things that could be enjoyed by a straight audience in one way, but understood in a totally different way by an LGBTQ audience. For example, let's say you are a student at the University of Kentucky. It's February 1917. You go to the library, you pick up the latest National Geographic, right? Widely spread magazine. You're flipping through it, and then you run across this. Believe it or not, this is an ad for Ivory soap. Published in National Geographic in February 1917. The illustration here was made by an illustrator we know now to have been gay. His name was J.C. Leyendecker. And it looks flatly pornographic. I mean, there's a lot of cruising going on in this locker room. And it's so tongue-in-cheek. In fact, the very opening line of this soap ad is, "Not the least of the pleasures of a hard game is the bath that follows it." So exactly what kind of pleasure these men are expecting to have in that locker room after J.C. Leyendecker certainly lets them run. And as this ad shows, gay folks are there, right? They're living their lives, and sometimes they're having a laugh at the expense of Ivory soap. These photographs, I love these. These photographs are just two from a collection of about 100. And they were all collected by a gay man. He was from Central Kentucky. He moved to Louisville, Kentucky. And for about 40 years, he would go around to junk shops, antique stores, flea markets, and he would find photographs that to him were gay. And that's all it had to take it. He said there was something about the eyes is how he would tell. And he collected these for decades. You know, they're all anonymous. The only thing they have in common is they were all collected in Kentucky. And they're enticing. You know, are these women just friendly with one another? Are they just playing dress up? You know, or is there something more? You know, who are these Kentuckians? You know, we'll probably never know. But we do have glimpses that start appearing, a separation of the veil. For example, in Muhlenberg County in 1903, the local newspaper there publishes one short article with quite the headline, "Mr. Bark was a woman." Mr. Bark, it turns out, was a Miss Green who had lived in Muhlenberg County for 13 years. And no one knew that Aaron Bark was a woman, female, until Aaron Bark died. And this wasn't discovered until his death. And that's all we know. Like, that's all we know about Aaron Bark's story. By the 1920s, though, we can begin seeing individuals whose stories are more complete. Certainly the most famous is Sweet Evening Breeze, born James Herndon. Several of you tonight probably have heard about Sweets. Sweets was born sometime in the 1890s in Georgetown, Kentucky, in Scott County. He claimed that he was abandoned at Good Samaritan Hospital in Lexington as a child, although that is probably almost certainly not true. But Sweets did grow up to be head orderly there and was head orderly there for decades. She was notoriously effeminate, dressed as a man during the day, but often feminized her clothes, but in the evenings was typically dressed female. And you would never think that a gender-bending Black queer man in Central Kentucky would last very long, but Sweets was very oddly adored in some ways, protected by some folks, well-connected, and seemingly left alone most of the time. There are a lot of memories regarding Sweets, how, for example, during World War II, she would bring baked goods to the train station, you know, handing them out to soldiers as they left home. Very famous, her evening strolls downtown through UK's campus, through Transy's campus, but was particularly known for her closeness to the UK football team. In fact, the photograph you see here in the center is Sweets sitting in her home in Pearl Street, a historic Black neighborhood in Lexington, around 1954 with a UK football player. We know that Sweets was doing this in Lexington for decades. In fact, Sweets first shows up in 1920 in Lexington's papers. And it's completely open. I mean, literally advertised in the local papers. Here we can see Sweets dressed as a bride in the early 1930s, advertisements for her womanless weddings held at Baptist churches as fundraisers, a unique womanless fashion review and rainbow wedding, whatever that was. And then Sweets, of course, would perform at Woodland Auditorium. In fact, there was a Pulitzer Prize winning novelist who later wrote about watching Sweets perform at Woodland Auditorium in Lexington, and that Sweets descends from the rafters in a basket and pops out in her feminine frills to dance the passion dance of the bongo bangos. I would have loved to have seen that. But Sweets, while the best known of Lexington's sort of cross-dressing drag Black culture, was certainly not the only one. A large culture of Black drag was flourishing in central Kentucky. And it's also around this time in the mid-1950s that Sweets takes in a young boy from Eastern Kentucky into her home, and that was Henry Faulkner. Much like Paul Sawyer, Henry Faulkner is perhaps one of the most famous artists to come out of Kentucky. Faulkner, of course, is still very well known, very regarded as a painter and as an icon of Kentucky's gay community. In fact, this might be my favorite single image in the archive. Have you ever seen, a better example of pure joy than that? This was taken in 1949 by Henry's roommate in New York. His name was Edward Carpenter. Henry was raised in Eastern Kentucky, but would travel the world, making connections with many prominent folks. One of his closest friends was the famous playwright Tennessee Williams, and the archive is especially rich in material relating to Henry. Of course, our name comes from Henry Faulkner. And he has to be one of the best documented gay men from the 20th century. He was unabashedly open. He reveled in his sexuality. And this often got him into a lot of trouble. In fact, I've given talks on Henry. I've given talks on Sweets alone. So if you have any questions about those two in particular at the end, I can certainly help. But few queer people could be as open as Henry or as Sweets. And for very good reasons. It wasn't all fun and games, not at all. Kentucky could be a very dangerous place. Police harassment, social ostracism, and a real chance of violence. Henry is a perfect example. This is Henry's mugshot from 1951, taken in Washington, D.C. And this actually isn't taken by the police. This is taken by a psychiatric hospital where he would be forcibly imprisoned for over a year. And that is because he was caught having homosexual sex. He was imprisoned in psych wards at least twice in his life. Once in Louisville, he was arrested at least 5 times, probably a lot more than that. The second you see here is an article from Lexington from the mid-1960s, detailing local police undercover performing a vice raid at Henry's house. Despite this harassment, some queer folks in central Kentucky, they fared much worse. In 1960, Black culture was attacked. Shows that had just 25 years before been celebrated in Woodland Park Auditorium, publicized in Lexington's newspapers, were now raided by the police. So these photographs were actually taken by Lexington police at the Lyric Theater, which during the days of segregation was Lexington's Black movie house and performance space. So a drag show was going on that night. The police come in and they raid it. They actually arrest these two queens on charges of lewdness. These photographs published in the Lexington Leader and the Lexington Herald the next day. The raid on the Lyric Theater drag show was actually during the same time as a self-reported crackdown on perverts. And this led to a stage entrapment in the men's restroom of the Greyhound bus station, which was on Short Street in Lexington at that time. 10 men were arrested that night in 1961, including a music teacher who was at Shackleton's Music Store on Main Street, and he died by suicide the next day. Despite this persecution, there is a growing, a vibrant scene of LGBTQ folks coming together, although discreetly and typically in local bars. Here we can see Main Street in Lexington right before the Second World War. And you can see the Mayfair Bar right beside the State Theater, the Kentucky Theater. And in our interviews, it's remembered that the Mayfair Bar was an early example of a gay-friendly bar. And these would soon start to pop up in Lexington and in Louisville. So these are not gay bars themselves, but these are bars where that get a reputation that gay people can go there, and if they're discreet, if they play their cards right, they'll be tolerated there. And there's a number of these that pop up in Lexington. The Zebra Lounge, which was on North Limestone, is remembered as one. The Mayfair Bar was later replaced by the Southern Cocktail Lounge. And both of these bars were pretty seedy. They were actually notorious bookie joints. So if you wanted to go and place your bets, that's where you would go. And so queer folks often found refuge. They found homes in places that were pretty nefarious because they themselves were technically criminals too. But this space changes in 1963. It becomes another bar called the Gilded Cage. And this was a bar or restaurant that's actually owned by a gay couple. They're originally from Chicago. Their names were John Hill and Estelle Wilson. And this is the earliest exclusively gay bar in Kentucky. I got the chance to interview a police officer who walked this beat in the early 1960s. And he remembered going into the Gilded Cage, and he saw men dancing with men, women dancing with women. And he said he walked up to one male couple and he said, "Who's the man and who's the woman?" And that one of the men looked at him and he said, "This week, I'm the woman." And he, 60 years later, he is still laughing about that joke. In 1967, the Gilded Cage became the living room. You can see there that small matchbook cover. They advertised themselves as the gayest spot in town, wink, wink. Revelers, including Sweet Evening Breeze, enjoying that space. Drag shows start showing up at the living room, revitalizing that long history of drag culture. And you start to see these drag queens reappearing in ways that they really hadn't for about a decade or so. These are photographs of Lee Angelique, and they actually came to us from Portland, Oregon. And they were taken by a psychology student who was at the University of Kentucky. And in the fall of 1971, she followed Lee Angelique around as Lee performed in some of Kentucky's gay bars, drag bars, not only in Lexington, but in Louisville. And in fact, these photographs come from a bar in Newport, Kentucky. So the experience of LGBTQ folks is one of contradictions, right? There's harassment, but there's tolerance. There's community, but there's also anonymity. But these things are about to change. The modern gay liberation movement sweeps into Kentucky, and many would not only welcome that change, but would certainly fan the flames of liberation. The radical fight for gay rights in Kentucky is perhaps best epitomized by a group of students at the University of Kentucky. And they're young students. We're talking 18, 19-year-olds. And here are some more pictures from that photograph album of Lee and some of her fellow queens. So there was a group at the university in 1970, and they formed what is arguably the first openly gay organization in Kentucky, and it was called the Gay Liberation Front. It began as an after-hours class in 1970. It had students, it had non-students, both men and women, usually small. The meetings typically had about 8 students or so. And their mission was to give gay and lesbian people a space to meet outside bars. And they had some pretty grand ideas. In November of 1971, the students actually band together and they apply for formal recognition from the University of Kentucky. The university refused to acknowledge them. In fact, they even threatened to disband all student groups at UK before they would recognize a gay one. But the Gay Liberation Front, a lot of their members were part of the anti-war movement, were well informed in terms of organizing and civil rights actions. And so they sued the university. In fact, their president, he was a sophomore, he was 19, his name was Peter Taylor from Whitley County. In fact, I just saw Peter on Sunday night. And so he agreed to be the plaintiff in the case, effectively outing him to the entire state. The Gay Liberation Front, they will lose their case. The state attorney general at the time, his name was Ed Hancock, he described the group as a lawful group sprinkled with unlawful activity, which is a pretty great description. But the group would get to hold the first openly gay event on campus. The Gay Rights Cha-Cha is what it was called, held in the Student Center ballroom. It would take another decade before the university would recognize an LGBTQ student group. Lesbian women, well-trained from the anti-war and feminist movements, are especially adept at keeping this movement going. Radical feminist communes, at least 3, flourish in central Kentucky. The biggest one was actually located in Monticello. Everything from discussion groups to gardening clubs for lesbians are formed. Newsletters are printed, like Women Energy that you see there. One of the most long-lived and celebrated of these efforts is Amber Moon, which was an all-female music group that would draw hundreds of people to their concerts. And not surprisingly, it's the lesbian community that suffers tremendous oppression. In retaliation, the state actually makes lesbian sex explicitly illegal for the first time in 1974. The most iconic example of this repression comes in the mid-1970s when the local lesbian community is attacked by the FBI. So there was a lesbian couple that moved to Kentucky. Their real names were Catherine Power and Susan Sachs, but they lived here under an alias. They had been students at Brandeis University, heavily involved in the anti-war movement, and they had organized a bank robbery in Boston. And one of the responding police officers gets shot and killed by one of their accomplices. This couple, they go on the run, and they end up being some of the first women to ever make the FBI's most wanted list. And they come to Lexington. So they had heard that there was a huge lesbian feminist community here, part of a huge anti-war movement group here. And so they come to Kentucky. In fact, Susan Sachs would be a cook at Alfalfa's near campus, if you know where that restaurant is. So they're here for a little over a year. But in the middle of the night, they abscond. They had gotten word that the FBI had maybe found out they were in Kentucky, So they leave, and barely in time because the FBI had indeed found them. So they start coming into town, harassing lesbian women. The far-reaching consequences for Lexington. They start putting pressure on the lesbian community, eventually arresting 5 lesbian women and 1 gay man who refused to cooperate with their investigation. One lesbian woman, she was a student at UK, she'll be in prison for over a year, 14 months, for refusing to testify before a grand jury. The FBI will use blackmail. They threaten to out these women to their families, their employers. Agents go to bars like the Bungalow, a club on Mill Street. They start secretly photographing the patrons in order to have proof of people's homosexuality. A women's law group in Lexington produced the pamphlet that you see there, and distribute it around Lexington's lesbian community. And it tells you what to do, what were your rights if the FBI came knocking on your door or came knocking at your place of employment. That's how unsafe things were in Lexington. But despite, interestingly enough, in the middle of all of this, Susan Sachs will actually get arrested. They catch her. But as the Lexington Sixes become known, in fact, the book has just been published about them. As they will say, the questions were not about Susan Sachs and Kathy Power. They didn't know who Susan Sachs and Kathy Power was. What the FBI really wanted to know was how lesbian women, feminist women were organizing and communicating with each other. Catherine Power, though, she will stay on the lam until the mid-1990s. She gets married to a man, and actually will win a Betty Crocker Homemaker Award before she's gone as an anti-war activist about 30 years later. Pretty funny. Harassment that's going on, the genie's already out of the bottle. There's an explosion of groups, political action, and LGBTQ spaces, bars in particular. The living room morphs into Johnny Angels, a New York style disco, and the place is wild. It attracts some of disco's best talents like Sylvester, and perhaps most notably, Grace Jones, who you can see performing here on that large dance floor, which is still upstairs at Johnny Angels, now called the Bar Complex. These photographs were taken by Melissa Watts. The back parking lot is especially popular with those folks under 21 who can't enter or who can't afford to enter. The back parking lot of this space facing Water Street will also get notoriously cruisy, and this will become a very important site in the mid-1980s. Inside, Johnny Angel certainly had a glamorous affair. All of the workers wore tuxedos. No one, however, was more glamorous than Crystal Blue, a famous Lexington drag queen, a trans woman. Here she is on New Year's Eve in 1980, showcasing the glamour she was known for. Crystal Blue is still with us. She now lives in Atlanta, and still just as glamorous as she looks right here. But Johnny Angels is not the only place in town. You start to see the punk influence starting in gay bars. Bradley Picklesheimer, who you see there in her white wig, opened up 2 spots, Club A Go-Go, Cafe LMNOP, that mixed drag, punk, and even drew folks to its stage like the very famous, the incomparable Divine. Here you see her actually performing on stage in Lexington. And the sky really does seem the limit. But as the 1980s progressed, there was a dark cloud on the horizon. And at first, it seems really distant. It's just a blip on the screen, a rare disease, sometimes called a gay cancer, popping up in major American cities. In 1983, artist Frank Close will send this postcard from Lexington to our other archive co-founder, Bob Morgan, who's living in Florida. And the first line casually reads, "Shall we start to worry about AIDS?" It seems almost prophetic. This is what's on the other side of the postcard. The postcard itself is actually the crypt of Capuchin monks in Rome. And like a portent of what was to come, the bodies did indeed pile up. Queer people across Kentucky would be lost. The exact numbers are still unknown, but they're certainly in the thousands. You know, the story of the epidemic is usually told through urban centers like New York and San Francisco, but it was just as prevalent, just as devastating in Kentucky, perhaps even more so. And the archive has been particularly keen to collect the stories of that lost generation. The Lexington LGBTQ community mourned their dead. They fought the disease as best they could. But there is perhaps a silver lining to the AIDS epidemic, and that is mobilization and organization. In fact, in 1986, during a police entrapment, a police sting in that back parking lot of the bar complex, the police will arrest a 26-year-old nursing student whose name was Jeffrey Wasson. He was from Stanton, Kentucky. And Jeffrey refuses to go. He challenges his arrest, and he will eventually spend 7 years in court. His case will go up to the Kentucky Supreme Court, and there his group of lawyers, all from Kentucky, will argue that the consensual sodomy laws of Kentucky are unconstitutional, that it breaks the right to privacy guaranteed in the Constitution of Kentucky, and equal treatment under the law. It seems like a very impossible stance to take. It's 1986. This is the very apex of AIDS. These police stings are getting extraordinarily harsh. There are legitimate calls to quarantine and tattoo gay people, people with AIDS. And so the fact that Jeffrey Wasson makes this stance is amazing. Like I said, it takes 7 years, but eventually he goes to the Kentucky Supreme Court and he wins. The Supreme Court agrees with the argument that yes, their consensual sodomy laws are unconstitutional. And Kentucky is one of the first states in the US, and it is the very first state to overturn its consensual sodomy laws after the advent of AIDS. And this will start a snowball effect. Other states are watching this case. So activists in Georgia, activists in Arkansas, they will bring up cases and also overturn their consensual sodomy laws. The state of Texas does the same thing, but it's upheld within the state of Texas and it goes to the United States Supreme Court. And in 2003, the US Supreme Court strikes down consensual sodomy laws as unconstitutional, using the very same argument that Jeffrey Wasson and his team of lawyers made all the way back in Lexington in 1986. An amazing story. And it is that sense of community building, right, of activism that in many ways is brought out by the AIDS epidemic. You start to see arguments, conversations enlarge, including the one for gay marriage, but also just basic protections under the law. So Louisville will start to enact ordinances that protect sexual orientation, gender expression. Lexington will pass its fairness ordinance in 1999. And now there's, it's probably close to 20 cities across Kentucky that have such fairness ordinances. But even if Kentucky had equal protections for queer folks, that may still not be enough. In 2013, Kentucky passed the Religious Freedoms Act, which pretty much exempts anyone from following fairness ordinances if they feel it goes against their religious beliefs. Governor Beshear, the father, did veto this bill, but the state legislature overrode it. And it all stemmed back to an event that happened in Lexington, the Hands-On Originals case, which was a local print shop who refused to honor a bid they made to print the Lexington Gay Pride t-shirts in 2012 because they considered themselves to be a Christian business. So Hands-On Originals had violated Lexington's fairness ordinance. They are convicted of this. They're supposed to pay a fine. But Hands-On Originals sues the Human Rights Commission of Lexington, and they win using the Religious Freedom Act. And this is still a case that is, it has recently, right before the pandemic was hitting, the Kentucky Supreme Court. It has been held up by appeals courts within Kentucky, and it's a story still being written. You know, the story of Kentucky's LGBTQ community is far from being over. And the archive recognizes this. And so we look at the same factors that we find in our history. Repression, homophobia, apathy will affect what stories from today make it into the future. So we collect material from events and from lives as they happen. This is one of our most popular pieces in the archive from a Kentucky artist named Cassie Lewis, who chronicles the trans community of Kentucky. This great piece of hers is called In Smoking, and it shows the presence, the sort of the joy, the frivolity of Cassie and her friends. Or these Polaroid images taken by an artist who often goes by the name of White Fox, named James Lyon, from 2013. Or these photographs from the artist Louis Beckett, who has since passed away since he took those, and who donated an extensive collection of his photographs to the archive. And I love the color, I love the expression that you see here. I especially love this one. And so what I've shared today is just a sampling of the stories, the tragedies, the triumphs, the lives that the Faulkner Morgan Archive represents, and stories like yours. We are always collecting. So if you have a dusty box of photographs, an old t-shirt, you know, something that tells us about the LGBTQ community of Kentucky, you know, we're interested. Your story is important. So I am more than happy to take questions, to hear your comments, and to share more. So thank you all. So do we have any questions? Looks like we have about 15 minutes or so.
So, Dr. Coleman?
Yes.
Can you hear me? I don't have a question so much as just a comment. I was lucky enough to be a teenager in Lexington and got smuggled into Johnny Angel's when I was 18. And oh my God, that was a fabulous place, is all I can say. Stepping off that elevator made you feel like Dorothy walking into Oz, because it was just
it's so funny because there are lots of folks who, and that might simply be a pretty common theme in queer lives. The first time queer folks get to go into an explicitly queer space, because I have that. It wasn't at Johnny Angel's or the bar complex, but I know that feeling. And we hear that all the time when it comes to Johnny Angel's For some folks, it's the gilded cage. In fact, one of the couples that in 2015 that sued as part of the Supreme Court marriage decision met at the gilded cage in something like 1965 and had been together until 2015. So I love how those spaces can elicit those feelings for people. This past week, we got to have a celebration in honor of the country, which was arguably Kentucky's first lesbian bar, definitely Lexington's first lesbian bar. And it closed in the early 1980s. And so we went back to that space. We had a night there on Thursday. And seeing those folks, most of whom are women, a few now identify as trans, but returning to that space for the first time in 40 years for some of them, really brought up those feelings of what it was like to feel safe, what it was like to feel a community. So thank you for sharing that.
Oh, we have a question.
Oh yeah, that was awesome, John. And I can't believe we were
Thanks,
working
Jack.
out
It's so
together.
good to see you.
It's so good to see you. I can't believe we're working out the whole time and not talking just queer history. Why were we working out so hard?
I don't know. Probably because we couldn't breathe.
It probably was. They did do a good job with us. This is so great. I'm so excited. I saw the article about the country, and then I'm so excited to be here. And I'm also really excited. When is your book being published? That was going to be my first. I can't wait to read it. I'm dying to read it. That's what Tracy and Vicky want to know. I want to know.
That is a wonderful question, and no one will like to see that book finished more than I would.
Feel that.
I'm still writing it.
Oh, okay,
So when the University Press of Kentucky took it under contract, it still wasn't finished, but which was very flattering because they sort of realized the importance of the story. So I am still writing as we speak. So hopefully soon.
Okay, I have a couple questions. I'm really excited. The first question is, was Johnny Angels designed by the person who designed Studio 54? Because many people have told me this. Is this in fact true?
The lighting of Johnny Angels was done by the folks who did the lighting at Studio 54. In fact, interestingly enough, so Johnny Angel and it's Johnny Angel without an S. They get very particular because Johnny Angel is a real person. So it is named, and he, after 40 some years, recently moved back to Central Kentucky. So Johnny Angel now lives in Kentucky again. And so Johnny Angel was from New York. His sugar daddy, basically, who funded the opening of Johnny Angel, moved him here to manage that bar. And so he hired the lighting designers from Studio 54 to come and do the lighting design there. He is very open. He has been back, to Johnny Angel since he's returned. And he says most of the lights just don't work anymore. So the actual system that they used, so he says, it's kind of a pale comparison to what it was. So it must have been pretty insane. But yes, it was the same lighting designers.
That's so cool. My other question was, where did people with HIV and AIDS go to the hospital? Because, the reason I asked is I briefly lived in Hartford and I was doing a tour with a community activist, and she said, the gay men used to live here. And I said, I've never heard about a gayborhood in Hartford, Connecticut. And she said, yeah, they all had to leave because the hospital wouldn't see them. And it occurred to me that there would have been so many other gayborhoods and more, gay and lesbian communities in different places, but people left to be with hospitals. So yeah, how did that work here?
That is an excellent question. And I really don't know. So interestingly enough, UK already had a reputation as UK hospitals as a place where people who today might identify as trans could possibly get some help. So there are some early stories about folks, moving to UK, to Lexington for that reason. I know that there were some groups, some panels of ethicists who were working on gender reassignment conversations, pretty early on in the 70s. In fact, Joan Callahan, who taught at UK for a long time, was on those panels. And so I know UK already had a reputation as being, UK hospitals as a place that was being pretty friendly. How that ended up during the AIDS, HIV crisis, I don't really know.
Yeah.
And it gets so desperate so quickly. What is perhaps best represented in the archive is the community-generated response to it, which happens fairly quickly in Kentucky. As you get that postcard, for example, that I mentioned in 1983. So there are folks in Kentucky who are already thinking about this, worried about this in 1983. And there are groups that form. One of the first that forms is Artists Against AIDS. And so these are folks who create artwork that they then sell, they donate. And this is to buy experimental medicines for folks like AZT. And they would have these auctions called Dick Art Shows. And that's exactly what they were. They were homoerotic works of art that they would then, one of the shows was at Crossings, for example, which is still around today. And that bar would close and they would have these Dick Art auctions. And then those monies, would be dispersed. Different groups, Movable Feast is one that forms. Another group that forms, which is still around, is of course AVOL, AIDS Volunteers of Lexington, which actually starts as a committee of the Gay Services Organization, which was founded in 1978, maybe something like that. And of course is still an extraordinarily vibrant nonprofit working on the fight against HIV/AIDS in Kentucky today. But the question about medical care is a very good one. And where was it? And could it be found? Interestingly enough, one of the first places one could get an HIV test in a doctor's office in the United States was a practice in Greenwich Village, which is of course why they probably did it there. Big gay neighborhood. But one of the 4 people who worked in that office, his name was Shay Metcalf. And Shay Metcalf was actually from Lancaster, Kentucky. And if you've ever watched, there's a documentary called Gay Sex in the 70s. And they interviewed that medical physician who was in charge of that office. And I had a chance to talk with him because I was interested in Shay. And so Shay was one of the very first Americans to ever get an HIV test, and it came back positive. Shay was beautiful. He and his partner were had lots and lots of lovers, and they have a huge impact on the early safe-sex practices in New York. And one of the most moving things, the doctor and his partner, they survived, that Shay and his partner did not. One of the most moving conversations I've ever had is that doctor talking about the thousands and thousands of lives that Shay and his partner must have saved by having those conversations early on. So and that's the thing about the archive, right? We focus on Kentucky's LGBTQ community, but there's that diaspora. So you find Kentuckians everywhere having an impact, on a national level.
And I just have one tip, which is the Episcopalian Archives in the University of Kentucky. The Episcopalians did most of the organizing on campus for HIV/AIDS.
Really?
Sarah Watson, who runs the MAP library, oversees the Episcopalian student group, and she told me there was tons of really great stuff in there. And that most of the 80s LGBT, lesbian and gay organizing was through the Episcopalians. So that's
very fascinating. There is, because there's actually a gay Episcopalian that I'm trying to find out more about. His name was Bill Richardson. And he was born in Lexington in probably the 1920s, went to Christ Cathedral. And then he was the minister at St. George's in New Orleans when the upstairs lounge fire happened, which killed 30-some gay people at a gay bar arson. And he allows his church to open it for a memorial service for those victims. And then he himself will eventually come out as gay and start the PFLAG chapter in New Orleans. And he just died a few years ago. He lived a long, long time. But he always kept connections to Kentucky and to Lexington's Episcopalian community. So let's see. Other questions? You can tell I take a long time sometimes to answer.
I think most of the questions were about the book, but does anybody else have another question?
John, this is Jane Brake. I'm here with Anna Main. And
Hi.
Anna is retired. She was the first director for the state of Kentucky for the AIDS HIV program. This was back in the early 90s. And she is saying that UK was the place that they were aware of that was friendly to treating the AIDS HIV patients.
Yeah, most of the things, I've never thought about it in a systematic way, but just anecdotally, I know that that is where most of the folks, when they were talking about especially the early experience with AIDS and HIV, they're typically getting medical care at UK.
Right. And AVOL was quite involved at that time. I don't know about now, but they were very much involved in guiding people to where they needed to go for treatment.
Thank you. That's great. Oh, thank you, Tracy. So I thought I saw Margaret's name pop up somewhere. And Aunt Dot. Thank you all for showing up. Hey, Tracy. See, I have fans. That's great to know.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much for the work you're doing. Thank you.
Well, we probably have, I want to make sure that
Wait, I have one more question then. I'm sorry, I'm also a queer historian. That's why I'm like this. So what do you think, after you probably read all these other queer histories, it's always about New York. I wrote a book about New York. It's embarrassing, and now I teach at UK. But like, what is special about Kentucky? Like, there are these unique things like the sodomy laws winding down. And what is that? Like, what do you think is unique about Kentucky? Like,
right.
I think it's special as hell, but what do you think?
Right. I think Kentucky does play a role in the national LGBTQ conversations in some pretty fascinating ways. One, Kentucky is certainly oversized in the national imagination of what it is to be an LGBTQ person. Kim Davis, which is the title of my preface of my book, is a perfect example of this. So now I'm not interested in Kim Davis. I'm not interested in the Davids. The couple, what I'm interested in is the media response to that story, which is huge and all encompassing. And that story completely eradicates county clerks who are doing the very same thing in lots of other places, including the state of New York. But their stories don't get told, Kim's does. And why is that the case? Well, one thing, if you look at, she is always referred to as Kentuckian Kim Davis, Kentucky County Clerk Kim Davis. And I think that it's a trope, it's an easily formed narrative. So, and especially the fact that Kim is Appalachian. So when you hear Kim's voice, when you see Kim, right, she's a very powerful visual figure, and drag queens love her. I've seen so many drag queens play Kim Davis. And the fact that when they walk out, you know exactly who she is, tells you how powerful Kim Davis, just sort of the visual of Kim Davis is. And I compare it to, the big bellied sheriffs of the civil rights era, right? The minute you see them, the minute you hear their voice, you already know what the story is going to be, right? And I think that is a microcosm of the way that Kentucky is often represented as a nadir for queer folk. So that it's always otherized as this bad place to be LGBTQ, and you see it all the time. The first time federal hate crime legislation was tried was actually a Kentucky case, Kingdom Come State Park. When Oprah Winfrey wanted to talk about AIDS in small town America, she went to an Eastern Kentucky Appalachian town and interviewed about a swimming pool incident. So it's, once you start looking at it, it's everywhere. But at the same time, Kentucky also seems to have this extraordinarily vibrant community that I think follows some other trends, especially when it comes to the Black civil rights movement. So let's go back to New York, for example. If the first planned civil rights action by LGBTQ Americans, probably, I think you could debate it. But the first planned one was the sip-in at Julius's bar in Greenwich Village, which is still there today. And basically, you had 3-4 gay men in suits walk into that bar. It was illegal to serve open homosexuals. Julius's bar had just been raided for doing that like a week earlier. The organizer, his name was Dick Leish. Dick Leish had called the press. A photographer from the New York Times showed up. They walk in to Julius's bar. The bartender sets glasses in front of them, and Dick Leish says, "We are homosexuals. We plan to remain orderly, but we would like to be served." And the bartender puts his hands famously over the glasses. The New York Times photographer takes that photograph. It's now a very famous photograph. And it was to challenge if New York really could bar establishments from serving open homosexuals. And Dick Leish knew what he was doing. Obviously, the sip-in is a sit-in. What civil rights, Black civil rights movement folks were doing in the South to fight segregation. Dick Leish was from Kentucky. So he was president of the New York Mattachine Society, but he had literally just moved to New York. And it makes perfect sense. Why would a New Yorker know how to organize what is basically a sit-in? A New Yorker wouldn't, but a Kentuckian who's living in a segregated state and whose parents were involved in the Black civil rights movement in Louisville would know exactly what to do to organize a sip-in. And you see this all the time. And part of it, I think, might also do with larger trends of Kentuckians. Kentucky has always been an odd state. Kentuckians are more, state-minded than a lot of folks, right? Midwesterners or Midwesterners, Southerners or Southerners, that sort of thing. But Kentuckians are Kentuckians. And there might, and that tendency of, sort of proclaiming themselves as Kentuckians might have something to do with it, why they end up showing up in the records as such. But that's one of the overarching themes of the book. Why does Kentucky matter? Why is it different? And so those are arguments that as you can see, I'm still trying to flesh out.
I'm chuffed, John.
Thank you.
Did anybody else have another question or comment?
Oh, thank you for bringing up Carter's book, The Prettiest Star. Yeah, which is based on the swimming pool incident. Yeah, that was actually my hometown. And so, when I was a kid, I remember, I heard stories about Oprah having come to town. I would have been a baby when it happened. And so that took place, it was a town hall meeting style, and that took place about a mile away, from where I grew up. And on the show itself was on the West Virginia side, Williamson and Belfry's right there on the border of Kentucky and West Virginia. And in fact, one of the people who makes a very big splash on that show, my father is a minister, for the last few years of his life went to my father's church. So when I would go home, I would sit just a couple of pews behind one of those men who had some really nasty things to say. But Oprah came back and did like a "Where Are They Now" kind of thing. And he was also, that same man was also the most brokenhearted, was the most apologetic. His views, his outlook had changed. And so it was pretty neat to see that.
Anyone else? Well, it seems like there's a lot of interest in this book.
That's good. I'll tell my publisher.
But I definitely think if you're interested, when it does come out, we would love to do a signing with you at the library.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, for sure.
So I'll keep in touch with you, and I think it would be lovely to have you do a reading and signing. So we'll keep that on our radar.
So I will put so there is my email address that goes directly to me. FaulknerMorgan.org is also the website of the archive. So if you want to learn more about us, sign up for our email list, be aware of the work that we do. That's the best resource that we have. So thank you all. And thank you again to the Paul Sawyer Public Library for having me tonight.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Coleman. I really appreciate you joining us and sharing your time and your knowledge with us. And thank you to everyone who attended. And as I mentioned earlier, we did record this tonight, so we will post it on the PSPL YouTube page. So if you know someone who you think would enjoy this presentation, please send them that way. That'll be up in a couple days. And we hope that you will join us again. We are still just doing virtual programming right now, but eventually we'll all be back together. But until then, we're still going strong with virtual programming. Check out our website at www.pspl.org or the Paul Sawyer Public Library Facebook page for all of our programming for all ages. And we'd love to have you join us or stop by and see us at the library. So thank you to everyone. I hope you have a wonderful evening.